Hi everyone, Stepan here. I will continue the series on the Alekhine Defense with the 4 pawns attack, which is the most ambitious try for white against the Alekhine and the sharpest one by far, and it leads to middle games which are crazy and which often neither side understands. And if you haven't seen the introductory video on the Alekhine, please do, I left it in the description below. The 4 pawns attack tries to punish black's play, moving his knight out on f6 at the start of the game as much as possible. So the 4 pawns attack creates the broadest center possible and tries to exploit the fact that black lacks development and that black gave up the center. So let's see. After e4, knight to f6, the Alekhine defense, e5 chasing the knight away, knight to d5. We went over c4, the 2 pawns attack in the previous video. Now we are going to go over the main line. d4, d6 is what black plays every game. And now there are other options. There is knight to f3, the modern variation, several other options like bishop to c4. But today we are going to look at c4. And c4 chases the knight to b6. And after knight to b6, white can now choose between 2 of the most popular variations of the Alekhine defense and by far the 2 most played variations, and 2 variations which are considered to give white the biggest attacking chances. One of them is the exchange variation, which we are going to cover in the next video, and this is probably the most solid way for white to play and the most challenging variation for black to face. And the second one, which we are going over in this video, is the 4 pawns attack with f4. Now, I said that this is the most ambitious try. It's not the best try, and that's why most grandmasters steer clear from this variation and choose not to enter it, because often black is going to have immense counterplay and black is going to get what he wants, and that's destroying white's broad center. Now, if black isn't careful in this variation, then this center is formidable, it's gaining space, it's restricting the black pieces, and it gives white an open hand. So if black plays passively and doesn't attempt to develop his pieces quickly and open up the center, destroy it, then white is simply going to be better. And if black manages to destroy the center, then nobody knows what's going on. Both sides have attacking chances and both sides have huge play on all sides of the board. So as with the Alekhine or the Alekhine in general, black will once again get an active game, and once again the Alekhine is the perfect opening if you want to go for a win with the black pieces and not for some passive position. The 4 pawns attack is the best way to challenge that and to say, I'm not afraid of you, I'm going to crush you and you are going to be defeated. The Alekhine sucks. So the 4 pawns attack. Let's look over some dubious and less dubious continuations first. There is one move that has been played, it's called the Cambridge Gambit with g5. This move just doesn't work, and don't take obviously on g5, don't waste your time. If black ever captures, you can recapture with the bishop, so just continue with normal development. Knight c3, bishop g7 is the best move, and now queen to h5. This is already a winning advantage for white. gf4, bishop f4, d takes c5, bishop takes c5, bishop takes c5, queen takes c5, rook g8. White has a winning game. White can castle queenside immediately, and the game is basically over. I mean, there's nothing black can do. The engines give it as +2. For humans, I believe it's even more. So be very careful about going for the Cambridge Gambit. Even if you prepared something, the opening just doesn't work. The next variation I would like to look at is the Trifunovic variation, named after a Yugoslavian grandmaster. So bishop to f5 is his variation, and this transposes to the main line, basically, and it might confuse your opponents because it's a slightly different move order, but you're going to look when we cover the main lines that bishop f5 is going to be played more often than not, so this move will often transpose to the main lines. White should continue with knight c3, e6, you got your bishop outside of your pawn chain first. There's another move, there's d takes c5, but after f takes c5, e6, knight f3 transposes, basically. So after e6, knight f3, d takes c5, f takes c5, knight to c6, bishop to e3, bishop to e7. This is now the main line of the 4 pawns attack and what we will usually get. So the Trifunovic variation might be a nice ace to have up your sleeve to confuse a less experienced opponent, but be aware that it's going to transpose almost every game. And another line I would like to look at, which is actually very interesting, although it gives white a slightly bigger advantage than the main lines, is g6. This is the fianchetto variation, and black wants to go for a sort of modern or pierced defense without the knight on g8, but with the knight on b6 and with white having 4 pawns in the center. So knight c3, once again, you are going to continue with knight c3 basically whatever black plays on move 5. Bishop g7, bishop to e3, castles, c5. You want to play c5 to challenge black from challenging your center. So now knight 6 to d7, knight to f3, b6. Once b6 is played, you want to capture on d6, so cd6, cd6, bishop c4. A huge center for white. All of the minor pieces developed. Once you castle and move your queen to e2, you have finished your development. In turn, black has a hyper-modern pawn structure and no c5 anymore, but black can play f6 and usually does. I mean, nothing major for black, but if you want to confuse your opponents who play against the Alekhine with the 4 pawns attack, this is, I would say, the best way to do it. So if you want to get a game which your opponent probably won't know, then try g6, the fianchetto variation. It's very playable and quite good for black if you know the modern defense and the Pirts and the King's Indian and hyper-modern pawn structures where you have to look for pawn breaks in the center, etc. So the fianchetto variation is okay. Now the main line, by far the main line, is d takes e5. As white, you always recapture with the f-pawn. That was the point of playing f4. You know that d6 was played because black wants to capture your overextended e5 pawn, and the main idea behind the Alekhine for black is to take on e5. So once he takes, you use the fact that you played f4 and you take with the f-pawn. Here is the biggest branching of ways in the 4 pawns attack. The main line is knight to c6, but let's look at two different moves first. Bishop f5, same as in the Trifunovic variation, most often transposes knight c3, e6, knight f3, knight c6, and now you have entered the main line. However, after knight to f3, black can choose to play the move bishop to b4. And bishop to b4 is quite different, but I would say that it's less good than the main lines, because now bishop d3, c5, bishop takes f5, e takes f5, d5 is quite good for white, and this structure is now great. The knight can take on c4, but there's a check incoming, so you can't really do that, and you're going to lose something. It's going to be very risky to play this way. So I would say that this is okay for white. So the move bishop to f5 on move 6 either transposes to the main lines or leads to this complication, which I wouldn't recommend for black. And another line which you could play after f takes c5 is the move c5. And this is a very aggressive line, which not too many people play because there's a check incoming, which you might face. And obviously... and obviously after c5, white is going to play d5. Black's main idea is to play e6 because black knows that white can't play d6. If white could play d6 without being punished, then this would be winning for white. However, if white plays d6 here, then queen to h4 is just winning. 2 pawns are hanging, and after king e2, queen e4 check, king f2, queen takes e5, black has a won game. This is game over. So after c5, which is a very aggressive move, you should continue with d5, but after e6, be very careful. Never play d6, because you will lose the game. The move here is knight to c3, simply defending the pawn. After knight to c3, e takes d5, c takes d5, and c4 is surprisingly the best move, but it does restrict the white bishop from developing normally, and it also removes the pawn so that black can have some ideas of knight to d7, knight to c5. White now continues with knight to f3. Bishop to b4 is the main move, pinning the knight, which is now double attacking the d5 pawn twice, so you have to react. And there's now a tactical trick which can win a pawn for white. You can actually take on c4. So bishop takes c4, The main move is bishop takes c3. If you take the bishop, you still lose a piece because of queen check. So bishop takes c3, b takes c3, knight takes c4, queen a4 check, knight e7, queen takes c4. If you count the material, 5 pawns for black, 6 pawns for white. White has an almost winning position with the overextended center, and these pawns are not hanging pawns. You can remove your queen, play c4, and I think that this variation is just too good for white for black to enter. So let's go from the top: e4, knight f6, e5, knight b5, d4, d6, c4, knight b6. The 4 pawns attack with f4, f takes c5. With f4, d takes c5, f takes c5, and now if you play c5 with black, be very careful. d5, e6, as white never played d6 because that loses, but knight to c3, and now ed5, cd5, and if you play this variation with c4, then be prepared for knight f3, bishop b4, bishop takes c4. There's another move here, but c4 has been played 72 times, queen h4 has been played only 6 times, so queen h4 is another move. But I think that it's not as good. After queen to h4, white actually isn't in trouble. You can just play g3, and there's nothing major going on in this position. All the key squares are covered, and black's best try is queen to d4. Now you can either play bishop f4 or bishop b5 check, and black is perfectly fine. So I'm not sure that the c5 variation is that good for black, but of course it gives you a lot of chances with the queen checks, with the risk of white sometimes playing d6, and it's a very active move nonetheless. But the main lines: after f4, the 4 pawns attack, d takes c5, f takes c5. By far the best move and the most popular move is knight to c6. Now it's not really provoking the move d5 yet, because the e5 pawn is hanging, but it's the best move and it's developing a piece. So let's continue. Bishop to e3, because your d4 pawn was attacked. Bishop to f5, and this is what I said about transposing to the Trifunovic variation. Knight c3, e6, once the bishop is outside of the pawn chain, play e6. Now we have transposed from the Trifunovic to the main line. Knight to f3, white continues with his development, defends the d4 pawn some more. Now there is a branching of ways, and I would always recommend the main line because the other move moves the same piece twice, and that's bishop to g4. I'm not sure about this move. White is supposed to have a huge advantage here, more than +1. Bishop e2, bishop takes f3, g takes f3, queen h4 check. Okay, you did get a check in, but bishop f2, queen f4, c5, you have nothing. The knight is going back. Queen c1, exchanging the queens, and your d4 pawn is weak, but there's really nothing to attack it, and white has the bishop pair. White has much more space, and white should be much better here. So after knight to f3, the main move for black should not be moving the bishop twice, but bishop to e7, developing, preparing to castle. Here white can choose between 2 moves, and this is, I would say, the biggest branching in Grandmaster games, because now you choose between a very active move, opening up the position, and a developing move, preparing to castle. The main move here is bishop to e2, simply developing your last piece, castling, and having a safe game. A sideline, which is very aggressive, is d5. You strike at black's d6, e6 pawn and want to open the position up. So e takes d5, c takes d5. Now you play knight to b4 with black, threatening some checks on c2, attacking this pawn 3 times now. The main move is knight to d4, defending c2, and attacking the bishop, so black has no time to take on d5. So bishop to d7, defending the bishop, and now your main move is e6. F takes c6, d takes c6, bishop to c6 for black, and now a very forcing line: knight takes c6, queen takes, rook takes, knight c2 check, king to d2, knight takes c3, king takes c3, b takes c6. Here you have an equal position with white. You don't have anything. It's 5 pawns each. You have a passed pawn on e6, but you could argue for a year whether this pawn was strong or weak. I myself would say that it's weak, but in compensation you have doubled pawns on the c-file for black, so black doesn't really have that much if he wins the pawn. So let's go over that once more. From here, so the 4 pawns attack. D takes c5, f takes c5, knight takes c6, the main line. Bishop to e3, bishop f5, knight c3, e6, knight f3, bishop e7, and now you choose. Bishop e2, as I said, is the main line. We are going to go over that now. But a very interesting sideline on move 10 is to play d5. What you need to be prepared for, though, is the endgame we just saw, in which the material is equal, you have a weakness on e6, and black has doubled c-pawns. So let's go over the variation once more. E takes d5, c takes d5, always capture it with the pawn. Knight b4, black's only move, threatening knight c2 check. Knight d4, white's only move. The bishop retreating, the only move. E6, fe6, de6, bishop to c6. The bishop is very strong, so you play knight takes c6, allowing a queen trade. Queen d1, rook d1, knight c2 check, king d2, takes, and your king is more active, so you got that. And sometimes you can play b3, bishop c4. If the knight moves, you can play a4, a5, dislodging the knight, and bishop c4. There are ways to preserve your pawn, definitely, and there are still 8 games from this position, and most often black will win. From this position on, black won 50% of the games and 50% were draws, so it's really hard to play for white with this weakness, but still d5, this is what you get with perfect play for black. If black doesn't play perfectly, then white is much better. But after knight f3, bishop to e7, let's look at bishop to e2. This is the best move, developing move, safest move. So both sides develop their bishops, bishop e7, bishop e2, now both sides castle. And now we come at the critical point in the 4 pawns attack. This is the main line, and if both sides play perfectly for 11 moves, 10 moves, this is what you are going to get. These are the best moves for black and for white. However, if you turn on the engine, it's +1 for white, and plus 0.8, +1. So the engine loves the fact that white has a space advantage, and that black's pieces don't have much scope. So black needs to react now. Black needs to play the move f6. This is your only pawn break. If you don't play f6, then you will need to play c5 or b6, c5 to open up the center this way, but then white will always have the move d5. So remember the move f6 with black. f6, white has to take. Whenever your opponent plays f5 or f6, if you don't know what to do, just take. It's almost always correct. ef6, bishop f6. Now black has a weakness on e6, but he managed to improve his bishop significantly. And this diagonal is actually very weak. The knight on c3 is weak, the b2 pawn is weak, the d4 pawn is weak. Count the attackers. White still has 3 defenders, but it's really tough to defend. Queen d2 is the best move. Queen to e7, rook a to d1, and now you play a normal position. With this break, f6 weakening the e6 pawn, you can see that black has almost managed to equalize. That's why this is the main line. The engines don't understand that you are going to have pawn breaks and that you are going to get space and activate your pieces. So this is the position you should study. I would advise you to take some games and to study them from this position. There have been 50 games from this position, Grandmaster games. There are a lot of games to study. You can look at Miguel Quinteros versus Oscar Pano from 1971. That game was a draw. Jumaev versus David from 2017. White won that game. So there are a lot of games, and you can find them in the databases on chessgames.com. You can find them on Lichess. This is the critical position you need to study. Here you need to find plans for white and for black. Black obviously doesn't want to enter an endgame because he has a weaker pawn structure, 3 pawn islands, and black has far less active knights than white. Black's bishops are better. So black is going to want to look for counterplay before entering the endgame, and white would be happy to exchange the pieces off and play against the isolated e6 pawn. Okay, everybody, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for all the support once again. I hope you liked the video. I hope you got a new weapon against the Alekhine or the Alekhine, or that you managed to reinforce your knowledge in the Alekhine against the 4 pawns attack. Thank you very much. Let me know what you think. I would really appreciate your feedback, and stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye bye.